Hello and welcome to this special edition of Access Asia. Almost a year since the pandemic began and China celebrates. Overrun hospitals have been replaced with crowded bars, restaurants, and markets. Unlike the West, life is returning to normal. A stunning recovery, and that hasn't been lost on China's spin doctors. Well, it's a tale of two cities. One deserted, residents living in fear of a newly discovered deadly disease. The other, a bustling, vibrant city full of life. In fact, it is two tales of one city, Wuhan, China. It went from a grueling 76-day lockdown to near zero transmissions. All the more startling as parts of the West, which had criticized China's handling of the pandemic, face record numbers of infections. Julia Kim has more.
Wuhan last winter, ground zero of a deadly new virus that would bring countries near and far to their knees. At the height of the world's strictest lockdown, 11 million people were forbidden to go outside for 2.5 months. But since April, residents have enjoyed something that's eluded most people: a return to normality. Here, social distancing and the wearing of face masks are no longer compulsory.
Look at me, I'm not wearing a mask. Wuhan's defeated COVID.
City officials said 90% of the population had been tested by the 1st of June, a vital step to getting the economy back on track. Officially, just over 4,500 people have died from COVID in a population of 1.4 billion, and there have been no new deaths since April. But since the start of the outbreak, China's figures have generated skepticism, not least by some of the residents in the country's former epicentre. This man's aunt was admitted to hospital for an eye infection in January. During her stay, she contracted coronavirus and died several days later.
On her death certificate, the hospital put pulmonary infection. It wasn't counted as a coronavirus fatality, and that makes me really angry. I'm sure the authorities are lying, and there are at least twice as many deaths from COVID.
Public confidence, though, has largely been restored, with tourists all over China flocking to Wuhan, the city that crushed the coronavirus.
So that apparent return to normalcy has made China an outlier in the global economy. Factories are humming. Even the pandemic has provided opportunity. Manufacturers are churning out personal protective equipment at unprecedented levels. Yuka Roye has more.
The crouching tiger has sprung back into action. China is now selling more goods than at any other time, accounting for 25% of global exports, up from 21% last year.
We were the first to recover from the pandemic, and our economy is back on track. Now we can provide the whole world whatever people may need.
Sales of face masks generated 34 billion euros for China. Demand for other protective materials has also skyrocketed. As millions around the world are having to stay home once again, China's manufacturing engine is revving. It's exporting everything from indoor exercise bikes to computers to Wi-Fi extenders. We visited one company in Guangzhou in the south of the country.
She's testing the woofer for air leaks in the system.
American engineer Philip Richardson runs a factory that makes high-end speakers. He set up his business here 11 years ago. Currently, all of his employees on the assembly line are working overtime 6 days a week. Orders spiked after consumers in the US and Europe faced fresh lockdowns and started investing more into high-quality audio or home cinema systems.
I don't want to say the best thing that could happen for our business, but since COVID-19 occurred, our business has easily doubled.
Richardson's company is just one of China-based manufacturers benefiting from an amazing economic recovery. In October, China's exports grew 11% from a year earlier, at the fastest pace in 19 months.
And one more sign life is back to normal. China's propaganda machine is running at full speed. The whistleblowing doctor Li Wenliang, who was harassed by authorities after he issued the first warning about the disease has been recognized as a fallen patriot well after dying from the virus. And that's helped to diffuse public anger. For more, let's speak to Maria Repnikova, the author of Media Politics in China. Ms. Repnikova, thank you for speaking to France 24. You seem like the perfect guest for this. I wanted to begin by asking you, how has the media been used by the Chinese government throughout the pandemic?
The media has been used in a variety of ways throughout the pandemic. The two key roles have been that of monitoring and venting, as well as propaganda. So in the earlier days of the pandemic, especially in January and in early February, we've seen media outlets reporting in a very in-depth and professional manner about the various governance failures that have led up to the pandemic, including local level cover-ups, investigations about silencing of the doctors, including Dr. Li, as well as the origins of the pandemic, surveying the market, hygiene issues, and so forth. But then later on, the media has primarily played the role of propaganda, but also of inspiring unity across Chinese public and converging the public as a nation that's very proud in defeating the virus. Most recently, in recent months, the media has also played the role of depicting China as a global kind of a success story. So China is not only winning domestically, but it's also become a story that's renowned globally for defeating the virus, in contrast to countries like the United States that are still struggling with the pandemic.
And this message coming across not just in news reports, but also in entertainment as well, from TV shows that look like ER to even an opera. Chinese propaganda can be pretty creative, can't it? I mean, to the point where some of the audience may not even be aware of the subtleties of what they're watching.
Yeah, Chinese propaganda has evolved over the past decade or even two to become a lot more creative than people imagine it to be. It's often associated with something dry and Leninist and almost unpleasant in the eyes of Western public. But in reality, it does deploy a variety of mediums, including entertainment. So we've seen TV productions about Wuhan, for instance, being kind of started up already back in February. And then people watching these TV productions are primarily getting a more kind of patriotic and sentimental feel about, again, kind of this individual heroes, doctors, nurses, people who delivered food, those who helped others survive the pandemic. So this notion of kind of propaganda is deploying the entertainment means, but it's also using ordinary heroes to project the message of the strength of the nation. So it's not so much only about the government, but it's also about the people themselves.
And there are indeed real successes to celebrate in China. But is there concern that some of the tragedy and the losses will be swept under the rug?
Well, China has this kind of way of getting over crises very quickly. This is not the first time. The crises I've studied over time as well show that there is this tendency to go really quickly to fix things and move forward and not look back. So there's not a lot of space to look back and reflect on what sort of things maybe have gone wrong, or especially to give space for trauma, for release of that sadness and all those sentiments that, of course, have been brewing over time. But it's hard to say how those will be reappearing again, because at the moment, the more sensitive topics are already censored, and there's a lot more emphasis on going forward, as many people have gone back to work and life has returned as normal.
I'm wondering, could there be an ulterior motive with this propaganda? China celebrating draconian measures, taking talking drones and so on, legitimizing efforts of expanding surveillance and its security state?
Well, propaganda always comes along with surveillance and censorship. So those two mechanisms, kind of control and persuasion, are always side by side. So as they're intensifying propaganda, there's also a lot more emphasis on surveillance and control. So, for example, after investigative reports have kind of been stopped, there is a lot more emphasis on censorship. What kind of messages can be passed? What kind of messages cannot be distributed? And alongside with that, there's a lot more propaganda. So those two tend to always come together in China's media governance.
And amid all these efforts by China, what is the country's reputation internationally?
Well, the reputation internationally has suffered because obviously the virus has started in China, and the story has emerged from there. And the idea, or the fact that the initial news were silenced, especially when it comes to Dr. Li Wenliang's and his death, was heavily reported around the world. I think that also has hurt kind of the legitimacy of the Chinese party state globally. But they're working very hard to rebuild their reputation, especially in the developing world, where they've been donating immensely to the efforts to kind of curb the virus. And also globally as well. So I think there's kind of the sense that the government is working very hard to rebuild its image by speaking out in international organizations like the WHO, but also by donating equipment and kind of material means. But how long it will take to repair or improve that, that's a little bit difficult to say at the moment.
Ms. Repnikova, we have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your analysis, Maria Repnikova.
Thanks.
Well, the vaccine could spell the beginning of the end of the pandemic. Scientists are racing to compress a decade's worth of work into less than a year's time. 3 Chinese companies have reached the 3rd phase of clinical trials. This report from Arnaud Miguet at our sister channel, France 2.
China was the first country to fall ill and the first country to start the search for a vaccine, a quest that's been in the news since March.
The vaccine is the shield against the virus.
No vaccine is complete without clinical trials. Doctors, soldiers, and ordinary families volunteered to receive the experimental jabs from a number of Chinese pharmaceutical companies.
This was my chance to make myself useful for my country.
3 companies have now reached the final phase of testing: Sinovac, CanSino Bio, and Sinopharm with its 2 products. With levels of Covid-19 too low in China, trials are taking place abroad, in countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, and Brazil. In exchange, China's offered them preferential pricing and supply. It's also promised unspecified assistance to developing countries to access its vaccines.
Covid-19 will be the showcase for Chinese vaccines to show their capability and also show their contribution to the public health globally.
120,000 doses of Coronavac were shipped to Sao Paulo last week, the first of 6 million doses it's ordered from Beijing. Distribution, though, won't happen immediately.
We're going to follow protocol. We're obviously going to wait for the conclusion of the 3rd stage of the vaccine's testing.
Back in China, though, there's no time to wait. Testing has yet to conclude, but almost 1 million people have already been vaccinated. An emergency green light given to government officials, overseas travellers and students.
They asked me for proof that I had to go abroad, and then I went to the hospital and it was fine. It was just like a normal jab.
Despite unknowns such as the vaccine's effectiveness or side effects, people are queuing up outside this hospital to pay the equivalent of €50 for a jab. Experts, though, warn that taking these shortcuts could backfire, fueling wider public mistrust over the vaccines and potentially reducing their uptake.
Well, that's it for this edition. Thanks for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.